Arizona business leaders are eager for details, still feeling the impacts of that sudden closure of the main crossing to Rocky Point last month. Political editor Dennis Welch is here. What are you hearing?
Yeah, a lot of people talking about this. It's a big deal. A lot of people watching this one really closely, and that's because Mexico is Arizona's #1 trading partner, doing over $15 billion worth of business annually. So obviously, business leaders here in Arizona are closely watching any border deal, especially one like this. Now, Senate negotiators are putting the final touches on the proposal this week. It reportedly includes a requirement for the Department of Homeland Security to temporarily shut down the border to migrants who are seeking asylum during surges. Now, in that regard, a source in D.C. told Arizona's Family that the bill would not lead to another Lukeville situation where all business at the port of entry was shut down for a month. The White House hit Arizona economically in December when it shut down the port of entry in Lukeville during a near record surge at the time. That port alone does over $3 million worth of business every year, according to researchers at the University of Arizona. And while he waits on details of the bill to be released, President and CEO of the Arizona Chamber of Commerce told me that he's pleased with reports that the bipartisan border bill would still allow legal trade and travel.
We're trying to get through the text just like everyone else to understand exactly what's in this plan. But any plan that would shut down or really just like clamp down on legal trade and legal travel, that should not be acceptable to people. It's just like it's not acceptable that we have record amounts of illegal crossings.
Arizona Senator Kyrsten Sinema is one of the lawmakers spearheading this current immigration deal, which already faces some tough political hurdles ahead. Former President Donald Trump has urged Republicans over in the House to kill it, and House Speaker Mike Johnson has already pronounced the bipartisan effort